you so much for joining us today, CRWDP, and our first webinar series for 2019. Today we have two panelists joining us, Dan Samosh from Queen's University, and Linda, and I don't want to mutilate your name, so I'm going to let her introduce herself in a moment. What I wanted to say before we get started with Dan's presentation is thank you for all of those who were returning from last month's attempt and the new ones that we do have. Pleasure to introduce Dan. He is a PhD candidate in organizational behavior at the Smith School of Business at Queen's University. And he will be speaking today on the people with disabilities and leadership opportunities for that population. And Linda Niksic, who is with him, is a recent recipient of the David C. Onley Award for Leadership in Accessibility. So I would like to welcome Linda with us as well today. We're very fortunate to have both of them with us to present. And without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Dan.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much to those of you who came back and are tuning in for the second round. I'm very sorry for the technical difficulties that we experienced last time. So today, I'm going to be presenting to you talking about the career advancement of leaders with disabilities. And at the end of the presentation, Linda is going to join me to talk about some future research. So to begin, I'd like to share a bit of my own personal motivation for why I ended up doing this research on leadership and disability. And it started a few years ago when I went away from my studies on a medical leave. And when I returned to my work, I noticed that I was being treated differently and that this might mean that I was going to start experiencing barriers. And at the time, that was really quite worrisome for me as a PhD student. And it led me to ask a lot of questions because, you know, my aspirations hadn't changed, but some of the social circumstances around me had. So I did what many people would in that kind of a situation, and I spoke with people who I thought were knowledgeable. And what they shared with me is that persons with disabilities are underrepresented in leadership positions, and that this is true even in disability-related organizations. And so later on, I found in the research that this is also true. Now, what I did next was perhaps what many researchers might do, and I did a literature search. I wanted to know what is the relationship between disability and career advancement and disability and leadership entering those kinds of positions. And what I found was really quite stark. I put up this comparison because I think it's a valuable one to show some differences in the research literature. When we search gender, career advancement, and leadership, you'll see approximately 700 articles, and the majority of them are going to be on the topic of women in leadership positions or women in career advancement. And then when we do the same search for disability, we'll only get around 40 articles, and many of them are actually off topic. They'll be about leading someone with a disability rather than a leader who experiences a disability. So what I found here is that we don't have that much research. And as a PhD student, I thought, well, this means that this is something that I need to do. It's meaningful. And it led me to do the research that I'll talk to you about next. Now, before we get into that, just so that you know where we're heading today, I'll start off by going over the research questions that I have and some definitions so that we're on the same page. From there, I'll move on to a literature review talking about barriers and facilitators to career advancement and leadership. From there, I'll go into the work that I've conducted, starting with the methods, and then we'll dive right into the findings. The first element of the findings is a metaphor, which I think is really exciting, especially perhaps for those of you in the audience who are from a practice context, because this metaphor captures those factors that facilitate career advancement, and it's a way of conceptualizing the things that an individual needs to succeed. From there, we'll dive into one small piece of that metaphor, which is the role of external social networks. So those are people like family, friends, and role models, and the role that they played in the success of the people that I engaged with for my research. Last, Linda is going to join us to talk about future research and another metaphor called the butterfly metaphor, and I'll leave the description of that to her. So as is probably apparent to you by now, my main research question is understanding those factors that facilitate the career advancement of persons with disabilities into leadership positions. And I'm also interested in knowing about how these factors relate to each other, if they do. In terms of definitions, just to make sure we're on the same page, when I'm talking about disability in this study, I'm talking about the negative interaction between impairment and contextual factors. So this is kind of a mixed model, which is largely social in definition. So a large part of what I'm going to be talking about, especially when we're talking about barriers, is social environmental factors. Career advancement is a simple definition. I'm just really looking at promotion here, moving up through the ranks in an organization. And I talk about career advancement and leadership together because they are inherently connected. As a person moves up through an organization, they often end up with more authority. And authority is a part of the definition of leadership, right? If we're talking about formal leadership positions. So importantly here, there are other types of leadership within the literature, especially like informal types of leadership or relationship-based types or trait-based types. An example of one might be something like transformational leadership. I'm not talking about those things in this study. Leadership here is defined as role occupancy. So a leader is someone in a supervisor position, perhaps a manager, a director, an executive, and so on. So we can get now into some of the literature and what the literature says. We have a lot of research on barriers for persons with disabilities in terms of employment and in the workplace, but not necessarily that much on career advancement. What we do have, we can start off by thinking about attitudinal barriers, right? Some of these include employer fears regarding the performance of someone with a disability, cost of accommodation, negative reactions from coworkers and customers. And additionally, a meta-analysis in 2008 by Ren et al. Found some somewhat disappointing, I guess you might say, findings, where they found that persons with disabilities are, on average, receive biased performance ratings that are positive. So on average, an observer will say that someone with a disability performs better than someone without. And initially, you might see this as something positive, but it's also associated with receiving a lack of critical feedback. And when we're talking about promotion, this can be really important because it's not the review that matters so much as the feedback so that you can get better at what you're doing, because we need to learn to grow through our organizations and our jobs. Now next, even when these performance ratings are positively biased, the same observer will on average have a lower performance expectation of a person with a disability. So there's, in a statement, the belief that someone performed well in the past but won't perform well in the future. And this is problematic, right? Because again, thinking about promotion, entering leadership positions, we hire and we promote for future work. So if you don't think someone's going to perform well in the future, and this is the function of bias, really a stigma, then the person's probably not going to get the job. Next, we can look at the systemic level. We know from many data sets that persons with disabilities are often segregated into lower skilled jobs that have higher job insecurity and simply don't have the same promotion opportunities as professional work. Now, a third category for us to look at barriers also exists at the individual level within the person. These are called self-limiting behaviors, and they are important to note. They're fundamentally the internalization of social stigma. So after years of potentially being told that someone can't do something, the individual might start to believe that in fact they can't, even though they may have the requisite skills or the aptitude to do a certain job. So going on with barriers, we've talked about now some of the career advancement barriers, but what are the barriers that people experience when they are in a leadership position and they have a disability? There's even less research here, but what we find is that research still emphasizes career advancement. Leaders with disabilities talk about how they can't continue moving up through the ranks because of barriers. And often this is discussed in terms of metaphor. So a metaphor that many of you might be aware of, which originally comes from the gender literature, is the glass ceiling. In 1994 in the States, there was a big report written about all of the varied barriers that stop an individual from entering higher level leadership positions that's captured by this metaphor. The next one is called the glass cliff. And what this metaphor depicts is that there's a ledge that's unseen. And someone with a disability enters a leadership position, they achieve that role. Often it'll be defined as a management role in this case, but they're not given the resources that they need to succeed. So they're more likely than someone else to fall from that position. Now, the last metaphor here that's been discussed in the literature is called glass partitions. And this is a very interesting one because it builds to some extent on that idea of self-limiting behaviors, but really begins with this notion of environments that constrain. And what they find is that managers with disabilities, these two authors, Rolston and Williams in 2014, that managers with disabilities often fear losing the accommodations and the acceptance that they've received in their position. So what this does is it builds these virtual glass barriers around the individual, wherein they can't move laterally, they can't change positions, and then they won't move up. So this is, of course, problematic and leads people not to move up the ranks. So we have talked about the negative, the barriers. What about the positive? Here, again, we see even less research about those factors that facilitate career advancement. But we do have research on facilitators more generally that we can draw from. The first piece here are called career self-management strategies. These exist at the individual level, their behaviors and cognitive strategies. When we go up a level to the organizational and societal level, there are also factors that are important. And then last, we can talk about social networks. And so we're going to go into each of these now. So the first piece, career self-management strategies, simply, these are proactive behaviors, right? These are behaviors that the individual engages in so as to navigate challenges and to ultimately grow in their career. There are cognitive and behavioral elements. I'll talk more about the cognitive elements later. Those are really things like having a positive mindset and persistence. And just some examples of the behavioral piece are sensitizing observers to ability, advocating for disability in one's organization, and leveraging networks of similar others. So at the organizational level, we know that policy, practice, and culture matter, right? There was a study in 2016 that was really interesting that found that having a disability hiring policy in an organization and having disability training for HR managers was predictive of hiring persons with disabilities, and that in fact, the intention to hire was not. So having these policies in place is really important. And additionally, we know, right, that something like justice climate is important because it influences whether someone is willing to disclose a disability. And in the case of invisible disability, this is very important because in the right environment, disclosure can lead to access to supports that will help an individual thrive. And without that, of course, we see the opposite. Going up from the organizational level, we can talk at the societal level. And there, we can start with legislation, right? If we think about the AODA or the ADA in the States, the goal of legislation is often to increase accessibility while decreasing discrimination. Though, of course, we know that legislative mechanisms don't always work in the way that they are intended, and research, depending on the mechanism in question, shows mixed findings. And last, at the societal level, we can also talk about social movements. There was a really interesting paper written in 2004 by someone by the name of Noonan and her colleagues on the career advancement of women with physical and sensory disabilities. Really, it was about their success, rather. And what they found was that social movements were an important part of motivation to achieve for many of these women. So our last component here are social networks. We can break those up into two different categories of internal and external. Internal social networks are those networks that people have within the workplace, so they're your colleagues, your boss, and so on. And we know, of course, that these networks are essential. They give us access to mentorship, challenging tasks, workgroup inclusion, and many other factors that ultimately lead to career advancement opportunities. Now, what we know less about is the role of external social networks, family, friends, role models, in career advancement specifically. So something that I'm going to focus on for the remainder of the presentation is how these networks, these external social networks, influence the career advancement of leaders with disabilities. From the broader networks literature, we see that these networks are essential to a lot of people's careers. Beginning in the 70s, there was someone by the name of Granovetter who wrote a really interesting paper on what he called the strength of weak ties. So at the time, people thought that you would often get a job through someone in your close network, people that you know well. But what he found was that it was actually acquaintances that usually led to people finding jobs, because acquaintances are aware of things that your close social circle are not. Additionally, when we look at high status roles, which is important to this study because leadership positions are often high status, there is a relationship between achieving those positions and family and friends. So that's something that's going to come up again later. And additionally, from the disability literature, we know that during childhood, parents are often really influential in terms of socialization and how one views disability as one gets older. And of course, this is mainly in the case of congenital disability. So diving into the research that I've done now, we'll start just briefly going over the methods. This was an interpretive qualitative study. So I interviewed people. I asked them about their experiences of work and career advancement to learn what those factors are that they felt benefited them. These were semi-structured interviews. And as I collected data, as I interviewed participants, I would analyze that data and then change the interviews, the next ones that came up, depending on what people shared with me. So who were the participants of this study? There were 21 leaders with disabilities who were interviewed. 8 identified as female, 13 as male. In terms of impairments experienced, 12 identified with physical impairment, 7 sensory, 2 mental, 1 speech, and 1 learning. In terms of leadership roles, there's really a broad array of experience that is captured in the study. Some titles that were more junior were things like advisor, supervisor, and consultant. And then as we went up to the ranks, we had people in manager, executive, board member, political candidate, and mayor roles. And participants also came from a variety of sectors. So we really get to capture a lot of different experiences in what I'll describe to you next, because we had people from government, for-profit, and nonprofit involved. So what are the findings of this study? The first piece is the metaphor that I described earlier on. It's called the three-legged stool. So this came from Michael McDonald. He was one of the participants in the study. And he originally used this metaphor to describe that there are 3 factors that you need to succeed. The first one he called the self, which can within the literature be reframed as career self-management strategies. The second, social connections or social network. And then the third, systems or organizational and societal factors. And the idea behind this metaphor is that a stool requires 3 legs to be stable, right? And similarly, a career requires these 3 factors, these 3 facilitators, in order to move forward. Now, importantly, because everyone is, of course, an individual and has their own individual experiences, we can ask how generalizable is this concept across participants. And before going into that, it is just critical to note that this is not a random sample in the study, right? I wanted to talk to people who have been successful, so we shouldn't be generalizing this to the population more broadly. But in terms of participants, of 21 individuals, 17 commented on all 3 pillars as being important to their career. And then 4 discussed the first 2, the self-management strategies and social network. So this is pretty good preliminary evidence to show that really this metaphor is at play. These 3 factors are important if an individual wants to succeed. You can't just have all the career self-management strategies in the world. You need the social network as well, and those organizational and societal factors. So this metaphor can be put into a model. I'm only going to focus on the first step of the model, but I'll describe it now because there's an image on the screen. It begins with the external social network influencing the individual, influencing career self-management strategies. And from there, what I found is that there's this kind of feedback loop between the individual, their internal social network, or those people that they know in the workplace, and organizational and societal factors. But as I mentioned, we'll focus now on the external social network piece. So here, 15 of 21 participants noted that their external social network was quite important to their career development, and usually this operated in terms of influencing career self-management strategies. There were 3 pathways with which this operated. The first one is called fostering a positive disability identity and success. 10 participants commented on that. 3 participants commented on the second, which is modeling and promoting skills development. And the third is generating employment opportunities, and 3 participants commented on that. And we'll go into each of these now. So in terms of fostering a positive disability identity and success within participants, a lot of participants noted that their family and friends viewed disability as neutral, that they never once noted that disability should be a limitation for them. So people would say things like, my family, they didn't treat me differently, or didn't let me make excuses for myself. For other participants, being entrenched in disability communities was a really critical moment in their life, because this led them to realize that they were just like anybody else, that there is a spectrum of experience within the disability community, just as there are in any other communities, and that they could achieve. And interestingly, especially for participants who were growing up in around the 80s, role models such as Rick Hansen were noted as, participants would see someone like Rick Hansen breaking down barriers, and then they would get inspired and think, maybe I can do that too. Now, there was a general difference between participants with congenital and acquired impairments. Participants with congenital impairments tended to comment on the influence of family, friends, and role models, whereas participants with acquired impairments tended to focus specifically on the importance of friends. As they were experiencing a new way of living and trying to navigate that, it was often really friends that helped them through. Now, importantly, when we're talking about motivating success, this wasn't always through positivity, through treating people kindly, and through recognizing that disability should not be a limitation. It also happened through negative experience. An example here comes from Wolfgang Zimmermann, who is a participant in the study. And what he said is that part of what has motivated me is that several of my buddies committed suicide because in the late 80s, they were not accommodated. They didn't go back to work, and you have the classic combination of chronic pain, depression, despair, and no hope for the future. So in this case, we have someone who was motivated to succeed, to create institutional change within Canadian society because of extremely negative experiences. Our next path is modeling and promoting skills development. So 3 people commented on this. The first is about family teaching cultural skills. So this comes from who stated, I grew up in a hearing family, so I do have, I think, a better understanding of what the hearing world looks like. But when you look at people who are called strong culturally deaf, there's potential for cross-cultural conflict. The deaf approach is quite straightforward. Some may even call it blunt. They're very direct, and I think I've seen this with other cultures as well. But in the workplace, that is not always the best approach. For example, to get your attention, culturally deaf people will bang on a table or bang on the floor, and it's noisy. That wouldn't really work in a hearing workplace. I think because of my hearing family, I'm more aware of hearing culture. Next, for one participant, family who had similar experiences of disability were really important because they modeled skills for this participant to use within their career later. And these skills were specifically around coping emotionally, but also learning technical skills for how to deal with certain cognitive issues. So for this participant, they said, for me, it was family members who were able to relate to what I was saying and using them as a sounding board and then talking about things that worked for them and how I might be able to do the same thing. So our last path was generating employment opportunities. And this is really important because what I found was a lot of participants did comment on internal networks, those people in the workplace being critical to finding jobs. And this went along with what the network literature would tell us. It was weak ties that often led to job opportunities. The individual had decided that they wanted a career change or a job opportunity came up, and it usually came through their broader network. However, in 3 cases that were specific to experiencing disability-related employment barriers, so the person was not just looking for a job, they were looking for a job and they couldn't find one because of some form of barrier related to disability. In 3 cases, it was family and friends that generated opportunities for these individuals. And some of them have gone on to do amazing things, but it started with the family and friends helping them along the way. So a quote from Steve Mantis, who took part in this research as well, is at the bottom of this slide, and I'll just give you some context here. Steve was in the hospital after experiencing a workplace injury, and a prosthetist had just told him that he would not be going back to work in construction, which is what he was doing before, and that he also was not going to be working in any of the hobbies that he was interested in. So in Steve's words, he said that this prosthetist told him that his life is over. And in that moment, he stated to me, one of my neighbors comes in and says, "So let's get up and get going here, Steve." This was September. "Next spring, I want you to build my house." I said, "What, you can't see? Look, you want me to build you a house?" And he said, "Yeah, come on, let's go, get going. I want you to build my house." And so he created a vision for me that I didn't have, and he gave it to me. And I went, oh, well, maybe I could. If he thinks I could, maybe I could. So here, it's important to note, right, that these employment opportunities aren't just a chance to be productive, they're also an opportunity to believe in oneself and to move forward and to do things that the individual might not believe that they can do, even though they can. So in summary, right, we started off in terms of findings talking about the three-legged stool. So this came from Michael McDonald, and it's a positive metaphor of facilitators. And I think it's really exciting to have this here because we don't have any positive metaphors on disability, career advancement, and leadership. It is all negative. We have glass ceilings, glass cliffs, and glass partitions. And these are incredibly important metaphors as well because they highlight the role of barriers and how constraining they can be. But with a three-legged stool, we can start to understand that there are factors that can lead to success. And those are things that we would want to promote. Now we went into just one small piece of this metaphor, which begins with the influence of external social networks. Right in there were 3 pathways defined. First, fostering a positive disability identity and success. Second, modeling and promoting skills development. And third, generating employment opportunities. So now I'm going to turn it over to Linda. Linda, who participated in this research, and I have been engaging for a little while because we've realized that one very positive thing about this study is that it goes generally and it looks across nonprofit, for-profit, and government contexts. But there's also a need for understanding facilitators in more narrow contexts. So we're hoping to do some research on public service facilitators specifically. And Linda is now going to talk to you about another metaphor that explores this idea of disability and leadership.
I would like to share the metaphor of how the butterfly starts its journey of self-determination. First in a cocoon, where freedom to freely fly is not possible. Struggling to build strength in their wings inside the cocoon, they keep trying to move, and they eventually build enough strength to be able to open the cocoon with their wings of strength and fly and soar into a world of possibilities. Facilitators provide endless possibilities for success, and leaders with disabilities may find themselves up against adverse conditions that feel like being restricted in a cocoon. But at the same time, these highly adaptable and inventive leaders are building strength, and in time will be able to build strength in others with the aid of facilitators that believe in them and wish for them to soar without limits.
Okay. So thank you very much, Linda. That is our presentation, and I do want to comment that it's important to note, right, that we talked about the three-legged stool and we talked about the butterfly metaphor, and experience is varied. So we shouldn't say that there is one metaphor to capture everything, or even 2 metaphors to capture everything. This is just the beginning, hopefully, of a line of research where people look at these facilitating factors and build ways of understanding what those are so that they can be applied in practice contexts. Right before we finish, I do just want to thank the Center for Research on Work Disability Policy, which is a SSHRC funded organization because they funded some of this research. So on the screen, contact information for Linda and myself is here. If you have any questions in the future or you're just interested in connecting, please feel free to. And thank you very much for taking part in the presentation.
Thank you so much, Dan and Linda. Thank you both for joining us here today in our offices. I have 3 questions for you. I'm sure others will trickle in, but let me get started. Margaret Oldfield says, great presentation, Dan. I've read in other studies that employees with visible disabilities find that they need to manage others' reactions to them. For example, make them comfortable. Many do it through joking about themselves. Do you find that your participants use that strategy? If so, what were its negative and positive consequences? Thanks.
Thank you for that question. And that is a really important question. It came up, it was a strategy that a lot of people discussed. I define it as using humor to put other people at ease. Participants described exactly that someone that was new to them, often team members who they were managing, would be really uncomfortable. So one example of this that came from a participant by the name of Jeff Wilbon, which I thought was really quite clever of him, is that when Jeff would be working with a new team and there was someone who might be a little bit uncomfortable, he would say to them, you know, everyone, I have something that I want to share with you that's personal. And everyone would kind of hush and they'd wonder, what is Jeff going to share with me? What is this? And then they'd all come in and they'd put their ears closer and he'd whisper, I have a disability. And then this would break the ice because then people would go, okay, Jeff is comfortable laughing about this and talking about it openly. And Jeff would use this. He wouldn't just make a joke. He would use it as a way to let people know that he's open to talking about it, that he might need help now and then, and that, you know, this is a discussion that we can have. It's not something that people need to be silent about. Now, participants largely spoke about the positive side of humor, about how it relaxed people and ultimately humanized the individual, right? It gave an opportunity for all that discomfort to go away, and then for the person to go, oh, this is Dan, this is Jeff, this is a person, not someone with a disability. Now, in terms of the negative side, there was only one comment from a participant on that. And what this participant stated was that we shouldn't go too far with humor. So for them, they were saying, you know, when I'm dealing with a human rights situation, it's not the place for humor. This is serious and we don't need to be laughing about anything. But otherwise, there are many contexts for that person as well where it fits. So I hope that gets to your question.
Thank you, Dan. And Margaret, if you need clarification, please send us a message and I will take that back to Dan. So, and Margaret also asks, and I was wondering this as well through the presentation, so I'm glad you asked it, Margaret. Really neat that you gave names of some participants who are, of course, well known in Canada, at least in CRWDP. How did you describe your approach to breaching anonymity in your research ethics proposal?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I spent a lot of time on this. I realized that I do not see myself as the owner of participant stories, but rather they are the owners of their stories. And I went back and forth because I thought that anonymity is important often. People shouldn't have to have their names on something that they don't want to. But at the same time, if someone wants their name attached to something, they have that right because they are the owners of their data, not me. So with every participant, before the interviews, I went in great detail describing what this research might look like in the future, that there are going to be presentations such as this one and so on, and asking them if they want their name to be written down or if they don't want their name to be known. So some participants asked to be anonymous. So you might have noticed in the presentation, one person was described as anonymous, whereas others whom you may know were named. In addition to this, I didn't just tell people I'm going to take your information and then at some point do a presentation with it. I also have sent a couple versions of the paper thus far to participants and gave them the opportunity to see their quotes and then to let me know if they want those quotes within the paper and presentations as well.
Okay, thank you, Dan. I actually just want to tag onto that and circle back to the REP proposal. I imagine that using your participant's real name might have been a hurdle for you in getting your ethics approval. Did you find that was the case? And if so, how did REB respond?
Yes, so at least at Queen's, it was not an issue. Sorry there, I should be back now. At Queen's, it wasn't much of an issue. The ethics application itself was very detailed. I was pretty clear about the way that I was going to be using participants' information and that I would be going back to them to make sure that they're okay with it if they chose to have their name included. So I did not have any issues with the ethics board.
Interesting. Thank you, Dan. This next question actually is for Linda. Love your butterfly, Linda. How do you apply that metaphor in your workplace?
Well, what I can do is I can mention, I'll start with how I apply it to myself, I suppose, and then into the workplace, if that's okay. I have muscular dystrophy. So in terms of Dan's study, the congenital, when he covers the congenital perspective of it, I think for me, I was in a wheelchair when I was about 8 years old for several months. And so I recognized, and I think Dan captures this maybe in his study as well, because I shared with him how I could feel the difference of how I was treated when I was in a wheelchair versus walking. And also, I suppose it's considered invisible because unless I tell you, you're not going to know I have muscular dystrophy, which raises the issue of disclosing, quite frankly. So I went through a period of grappling about disclosing because I felt that everyone needs to just care about each other, regardless of who we are and whether we're marginalized or not, supposedly in society. Let's all be caring. And we're all in this precious life together. Unfortunately, though, we're in a very competitive world. And as Dan has covered with career progression, the barriers, for me, the butterfly, I relate to it personally because I don't know if all of you are familiar with RoboCop, but that's pretty much who I identify with, where every day I suffer pain and weakness, and every day I have to find a way to build strength when medically there's nothing out there for me. So I take an attitude of, well, that means I have to try to keep finding a way. And I believe in what Dan is doing in terms of trying to make a difference in all of us, to try to make a difference and just keep trying different ways to reach to all of us that we can thrive in the best way. And in terms of my butterfly metaphor, not only do I struggle in a cocoon, I relate to the cocoon big time every day. So I say this in a term of probably resilience, where I think we have to try. And I think what happens is it's not enough to believe in yourself. You really need other people in your life that believe in you too. And what I've witnessed and what I've experienced is how we deal with barriers in our lives. And for me, because it's been invisible, I've spent my life, and I continue to spend it, suffering in a way that I believe it's my burden. And I don't know if people are familiar with Viktor Frankl, but he wrote this book on man's search for meaning. And he speaks to how we all have our own individual burden, and how we carry it is the magnificent thing, I suppose, about each of us as individuals. And for me, I relate to the cocoon because I think I've experienced not only personally what it means to withhold that you're not open about that you have a disability, but that when you do disclose, it's difficult too. And I think Dan mentioned a beautiful example from Jeff Wilbond, where he's dealing with it. And I suppose in a way, like one of the people participating on this webinar asked, how do you deal with your disability if it's visible? And Jeff, who also has a congenital disability, that is how he's adapted. And that's, I think, the beauty, right, is how we can each find a way to adapt within our struggles. And I think for me, the cocoon, it's not as if I ever feel I'm out of that cocoon. I think my hope and dream is that we all have enough support around us, personally and professionally, that lift us each day and give us hope and help us pave a way for better, for not only ourselves, but that we're able to give back, that we're able to find that resilience in ourselves and to persevere. And I really do hope for a day where, as David C. Onley said in his speech when I, as well as 2 other colleagues, received an award, and he said that he hopes one day that we won't have to have an award for accessibility. And I think, wow, may that day come very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda, for sharing with us. You're getting online hugs. Also, you do have support out there, and yeah, I just feel compelled to share right now that Linda came all the way from Ottawa for this trip today, and just that she has, you know, faced what she has to face daily, but to make that travel to be present for this webinar is just simply amazing, and I want to thank her so much for doing that and making herself available. So Doug Waxman has a question. First, great presentation, Dan. Did your participants talk about being denied training and human capital development opportunities?
That is a good question. They spoke about accessibility barriers more broadly. I'm trying to think if there are specific examples of human capital opportunities. None come to mind currently, but that doesn't mean that they weren't discussed. However, there were lots of discussions around physical disability, and perhaps there is a job interview, and they'll get to the interview and the building is not accessible. So then the individual can no longer take part in that interview, as well as informal events where everyone is meeting outside of the workplace, which is known as a very important environment to build those informal social networks that are internal to the workplace and then grow. And then the individual might not even be told about the event because the colleague is too afraid to comment about it, or they are told about it and they're told, sorry, it's not accessible, so you can't come, rather than finding a solution that includes the person. So yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have a specific to your question, but I hope that those examples are still useful.
Before we move on to the next question, another message came in from an attendee that I want to share with Linda. Thank you so much, Linda, for your strength, courage, resilience, and willingness to share. It makes us all feel stronger, more hopeful, and not alone. Know that you are not alone on your journey. Wishing you continued strength and hope. And this came from Sue Birch, and I have to echo her. Thank you so much for sharing that, Sue. I completely agree. We agree in this room, and just thank you for those thoughts. So I'm going to move on to a question from Susan. This is a great presentation, Dan. Thank you. It speaks to me in many ways and raises some questions. I certainly relate to much of what you've covered. I was born with my disability. I use a wheelchair and I'm literally today having a hard day because one of my able-bodied friends is applying for a tenure-track position that I should also apply for, but I can't because it's physically so daunting for me. Between attendant care needs, self-care needs, I cannot teach from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. I need accommodations that do not fit with the physical barriers that the university is also addressing. But I also have to say that this very friend and colleague has been a great ally to me. She helps direct work toward me. I was disheartened that some of my colleagues are putting their bodies at physical risk to make tenure track, so that they then have negotiating power. I'd be curious as to how I could advocate this or get this across to the higher powers. Could we have access to some of your literature?
You absolutely can. If you want to send me an email afterwards, I will help in any way. Coming from the academic world, I understand personally the intensity of a lot of academia. And there was also one of my participants is a professor, and they discussed very similar things. One of the comments that they noted was that I will be given accommodations that are easy, but accommodation and acceptance for them was much like currency, and they felt that they really could only ask so much before other people started perceiving accommodation, which legally would be perceived as reasonable, as burdensome. So if there's any literature that I can help you with, please let me know. I'll gladly share.
Thank you, Dan. And everyone, you have Dan and Linda's emails on the question and answer slide at the end that we've kept up. So feel free to take those down during the rest of our Q&A session so that you can connect with them after. Alexandra is sending you support as well, Linda. There's a lot of support here online that's coming in. Dan, this is from Alexandra, I really enjoyed your presentation and your study. Did issues of disclosure come up with individuals identifying as having mental health issues?
That is a very good question. If we go back to the, I can actually go back on the slides now, to the slide on participants. You can see here that only 2 participants identified with mental disabilities. I didn't want that number to be so low, but there is so much stigma around mental health, at least in part. That might be the reason as well. Invisible disability means often in these research contexts that it might just be more difficult to connect with someone. But without question, disclosure came up as an issue. There was less of a willingness to have a name known, except for in one case, but the individual themselves was far along in their career and works to an extent in this area, so perhaps is in a more respectful environment than some others might be. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Dan. Mike has a comment and then a question. Informative presentation. Was there any findings in regards to persons with disabilities in a leadership position hesitating to take career risks, be it moving to a new job or a major decision on the job?
Yeah, absolutely. One example that comes to mind is a participant who stated to me that they had a role model who had achieved a very high level position within their industry. And it was a CEO position, I believe. And what they noted was that these kind of CEO positions have high turnover. It doesn't matter whether someone experiences disability or not, they have high turnover. And they achieved this position in an environment that was accommodating, but once they were let go, and other CEOs in such a context might move on to a new organization, this person couldn't find work that was at that same CEO level. So they ended up going back to being a frontline worker. And for this participant who is in a management position, this led them to question specifically, should they go back to get an MBA? Because are they going to even be afforded the opportunities that MBAs are afforded? And should they really shoot for those high-level positions? Because after all that hard work, if they get it, are they going to be able to keep it? So that absolutely came up. And if you look at the past literature, there's the paper by Wilson Kovacs et al. I think it's from 2008. It's cited within this presentation. That's the whole idea there is the glass cliff, right? You finally get to a leadership position. It's hard to get into a leadership position anyways. And then someone gets there while experiencing these barriers. And then once someone gets there, there's this chance that there's a cliff waiting for you, that you're not receiving the supports that you need. So you're a leader for a little while and then you fall from that position. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. We have a number of comments coming in online. Thanking you both for sharing. We have 10 minutes left, so if anyone has any other questions, we have time to take them. So while I'm waiting for questions to come in, I want to address the issue of stigma. So you mentioned stigma at the top of the presentation as being a systematic barrier, and along with that, a lot of the questions that get asked in the disability community is, we're told to go out and get a job, especially if you're on income support. The focus is on really getting you out there, getting a job. But you can be as job ready as you like. The jobs have to be there for you to go into, and the employers have to be willing and wanting to take you on board. How much of compare the stigma against your three-legged stool, and I'm wondering how powerful that stigma is in comparison to to the facilitators of the three-legged stool. Do we still have a long way to go? And if so, what do we need to do? What has your research shown? And what do you think needs to happen for employers to open up the employer space to people with disabilities?
Yeah, so that is a big question. And I'll get at it from some of the research that I've reviewed and then the research that's been conducted. The first piece is that I see the notion of stigma and barriers more broadly as the sort of the piece that is juxtaposed to the three-legged stool. So one facilitates and one causes barriers, one limits the individual. Within the framework that Michael McDonald noted, if those three pillars are there and they're stable, then the person will succeed. So if we move on with that metaphor, something that employers can do, for instance, is there are lots of programs that are on leadership development. So you teach the individual how to be a leader. How can you do well? How can you move up through the organization? That's fantastic. But if we look at it within the context of the metaphor, if we're only doing that as an organization and we are not building in organizational factors, questions around accommodation, around flexibility, then it doesn't matter how strong the individual is, they're not in an enabling environment. Similarly, you can have accommodations in place, you can have leadership programs in place, but if you are an organization that, let's say, has a poor justice climate, or let's say has just poor attitudes in general towards disability, then the social network isn't there. Then the person, again, has a piece missing that means at the very least that they are less likely to succeed, not that they're not going to. So I think from the practical what can organizations do piece, it's when you're building programs, they need to be multifaceted. They can't just look at one of these pillars, they have to look at all three. And the other piece that wasn't described too much in the presentation, but that I think is very important in the applied context, is that I spoke to 21 people and I distilled some of their experiences into 30 minutes. In reality, I spoke to each of them for an hour to over an hour, So there we have approximately, let's say, 25 hours of discussion that can't all be captured here. That was just an hour of their entire lives, which adds up to many, many years of experience. We can capture some of that experience in a study and in a presentation, but we can't capture all of it. What that means is that what I presented to you, the three-legged stool, is a framework. It is not a best practice that then needs to be applied in its exact way at all times. And in reality, organizations need to talk to their employees, and specifically their employees with disabilities, because nobody knows their experience better than they do. So I think that at the organizational level, research needs to be done to make sure that when you are working in these three areas, the career self-management strategies, the social networks, and the organizational factors, that they're being done for the employees who are there and the employees who are going to come in the future, not just, on the abstract level.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Margaret asks Linda, if you're comfortable doing so, could you please tell us about some of your experiences with disclosing your impairment at work? For example, what made it easier or harder to disclose?
Thanks for your question, and I want to thank Pam and Dan too for their support here, and all of you online and them sharing with me that you're out there. Thank you. I suppose what happened was throughout the work, I witnessed not only friends but colleagues with disabilities really struggling. And for me, my philosophy was always, we're all in this precious life together. And I thought, why would I self-identify? It's just against my philosophy. It's not what I believe in. And yet at the same time, I was like, but it's not that I don't want people to know that I have muscular dystrophy, but I felt like, what am I supposed to do? Say, hey, I have muscular, like, I don't know. It just sort of, it's very different when I was in a wheelchair. I'm dealing with people's attitudes when you're in a wheelchair. When you're not in a wheelchair, it's different. And it's almost like I take on that Viktor Frankl philosophy of it's my burden. It's up to me to have a positive attitude about life if I choose to have one like that. It's my choice how I present myself in the workplace. So I always felt it's my burden to carry, and I was very silent with it. In fact, I'd say silent even to loved ones. So I think when you take that on, it's hard because I, to this day, still want to prove that people with disabilities are high performers. And I believe we are high performers because just having to grapple with whatever your burden is, you're having to adapt to not only everyone around you, but you end up having people lean on you as well a lot, and you want them to prosper and grow. So I think self-identifying for me was incredibly difficult. I came to an impasse where I felt my philosophy wasn't going to carry me through. No one's ready. No one's ready for it. I can't apply it. No one's ready. And I could recognize that my colleagues and friends with disabilities, they needed me to self-identify, because then what happens is hopefully I can give strength to them, to others, and to myself too, that I don't feel isolated. Because by not talking about it and sharing, it's very isolating. And I think when I did disclose, however, it was very hard because it's, I suppose it's invisible for me because you don't know unless I tell you. Then I'm dealing with that attitudinal barrier because it's like, well, there's nothing wrong with you, right? Like, why don't you, so it's just bizarre. I don't get it. I don't understand it. I think because I persevere to demonstrate that people with disabilities are high performers. We're here together to raise each other and give strength to one another. And I do hope that it doesn't have to be a day that we have to self-identify. Like, why can't we just, have this conversation like we're having today, feel safe, to mention our limitations and have all of us around who are wrap around and lift each other in the best ways we can be there in our and operate in our full potential. You know, it's I want that so much. Like I want it so yesterday. I want it so, like, it's hard for me to fathom. We're 2019 and we're even having this discussion, and I think I just I really admire and all your support, and I embrace it, and I just want better so much for everyone.
Right. Well said. Thank you, Linda. We actually are at 1 o'clock, but we have 3 questions left. So don't go anywhere, the ones that are still on the phone. If you, yeah, on the webinar, if you have time, we can listen to the end of the Q&A, that would be great. Dan and Linda, do you have time? Okay, so unless I get kicked out of this boardroom, we will continue. So Sally says, thanks, Dan and Linda. Just wondering, Dan, how you are going to use this work going forward. It seems to me that organizations could learn a lot from your analysis in terms of considering change.
Yeah, so my hope is that this can be applied. The purpose of the research is, if possible, to make some change. So the first step is to publish some pieces of it. And then the next step, which really can also happen in tandem, is to see where this can work. So in that vein, for the 24 participants who are remaining in the room here, if any of this information is useful to you and your organization, please let me know, because I can talk to you further about it. Specifically, the metaphor is something that can be applied. I know that I focus specifically on the external network, but the research itself also looks into those career self-management strategies and how they worked, the internal networks and what they did, and those organizational factors. So there's a lot of room for this to be used. I will do my best to put it out there, and hopefully organizations will be interested.
Okay, thank you, Dan. And I think this is research that needs to be done. There's not a lot on it, so I'm keen to see the studies as they come out. Valerie says, very interesting findings, thank you. When I interviewed managers about their knowledge of hiring people with disabilities in general, and managers supervising autistic employees, they rarely spoke about their legal obligation. Most didn't seem aware of those laws. Did your participants speak about the role of legal protection against discrimination during the course of their career? Was it viewed as helpful?
That's a really good question. It did not come up often, but it did come up 2 times that I can think of now. One participant in particular used the threat of legal mechanisms quite well within their career. They were situations where they were clearly in the right and the legal mechanism would have favored with them. And they used the notion of, you know, this law exists, this is discrimination in X or Y form, and that did for this individual influence their outcomes in a positive manner. However, you know, there's also research that points towards, even though you have these mechanisms in place, there are norms that lead a lot of individuals, especially individuals with low power, so not necessarily people in leadership positions, to not want to use legal mechanisms even though they're there because they might be seen as rocking the boat and otherwise. So for some of these participants, for 2 specifically, they were very helpful. They were a way to let employers know, hey, this is not fair play. You need to change how you're acting. But I would caution that by saying that other literature shows that there are some real limitations when you force the individual who's in a lower power position to use a legal mechanism against somebody who determines whether they have a job or not.
Yes, so Dan, I wish we had another hour. I could talk on that issue. Mandy has a really good question. Thank you, Dan and Linda. Dan, did your study participants mention a number of reasons why people did not apply for promotions? For example, many supports and housing for persons with disabilities depend on finances. Therefore, if you get a promotion, you can make more money, and then you lose financial support towards your care.
Yeah, so the reasons for not going for a promotion were not related to like social assistance type funding within this study. However, there is other literature that describes those sorts of experiences of people who don't want to potentially even get a job or want to work part-time because when they go full-time, they'll no longer get the assistance that they require. One participant did discuss how they were given the option to go on social assistance or to go to university at one point, and their choice was to go to university at that point. Most of the reasons to not go for a promotion were internal or social in nature. So it was the feeling that they wouldn't get the promotion because of stigma, or the feeling that they might not be qualified for it, even though later in their life they realized, yeah, I was qualified. At that age earlier on, I just didn't think I was. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Margaret says, you know, the workplace that you're describing, Linda, is the workplace that I'm trying to build too. And I would like to end this webinar by saying this is an issue that I hope we continue to talk about, because even in 2019, when accessibility should just be accepted, and we don't really even need to have a word for accessibility in the workplace, the reality is we do. And so it is presentations like yours that will, you know, hopefully galvanize the community. So thank you so much for your webinar. We really appreciate the time that you took, Linda and Dan, from your day to present to us. And stay tuned next month in March, when we have Dana House presenting to us on her research on injured workers. So that information will be sent out within the next couple of weeks, and we invite you back. We invite you back with us then. So thank you, and everybody have a great day.